It is the 23rd of January 2023. My name is David Hickson, and in today's market update we're going to be taking a look at the S&P 500 and gold and also Bitcoin. Before we do that, I must ask you to please make sure that you have read and understood these disclaimers. We're going to take a very quick look at the S&P 500 first. This is the chart that we were looking at last week in the market update that I recorded, and I also recorded a new format of market update on Friday, which I called a geek update because it was really for the Hurst cycles geeks. It has a lot more detail and it delves into the nitty-gritty. If you are interested in that detail, then please make sure that you take a look at that video. I think you will find it interesting. The important thing here is that we were looking at price coming down into the 40-day cycle trough. And in last week's market update, I presented an 80-day cycle FLD and suggested that that FLD should provide resistance. It did, in fact, provide resistance, and price didn't advance above that 80-day cycle FLD, and it came down for the first 3 or 4 days of last week fairly strongly. As you can see, it came just down below the 20-day FLD. Now, the interesting thing is that the nest of lows, which we have at the foot of the chart for the 40-day cycle trough, you can see lines up very accurately. And let me actually clear those pen marks. The 3 cycles from 20 days all the way down to 5 days all line up very accurately with Thursday's bar, and you can see that was a low that formed. That is almost certainly the 40-day cycle trough. Now, the interesting thing about this 40-day cycle trough is that we would normally expect price to cross down below the FLD and form the 40-day cycle trough an equal distance below the FLD. That is what we would expect in a balanced market. You will know that we are tracking 2 different possible analyses. The one possible analysis has a bigger trough, an 18-month cycle trough, still expected over here towards the end of February. That has been my preferred analysis, and the alternate analysis is that the 18-month cycle trough occurred over here in the middle of October. Now, the fact that the 40-day cycle trough has probably formed at the level of the 20-day cycle FLD is a bullish sign, because it simply failed to cross below the FLD and reached its target to the downside. When it fails to do that, that is a bullish sign, which, as I mentioned in Friday's video, certainly tilts the odds in favor of the 18-month cycle trough having occurred in October. And so, as price bounces out of this 40-day cycle trough, it seems possible that the 18-month cycle trough now does indeed lie behind us. However, the debate is not absolutely concluded yet, because let me point out the cycle shape that has developed over here for the first 40 days. Let's hide that 20-day FLD. Here is the cycle shape for the first 40-day cycle. There it is over there. It is a very bullish shape, as you can see, with a very late peak over here. The next 40-day cycle is expected to be less bullish than that. And as a matter of interest, one could see a fairly symmetrical shape develop over here. If a symmetrical shape does develop, then of course the less bullish 40-day cycle will turn into a bearish 40-day cycle, and it is still possible that the analysis that has been our preferred analysis with the bigger trough over here at the end of February is going to turn out to be true. But certainly at the moment it looks as if the odds are tilting in the favor of the fact that the 18-month cycle trough lies behind us. And so, to conclude the section on the S&P 500, we are looking at price bouncing out of this 40-day cycle trough. We are expecting a less bullish 40-day cycle than we witnessed following the 80-day cycle trough in the 3rd week of December, but it seems that the bulls are still alive and well in the S&P 500, and bullish moves are still on the cards. Now let's take a look at gold, and it has been some time since I last did an update for gold. In the last update that I did for gold, I suggested that this trough that formed over here towards the end of 2022 could be a trough of really high magnitude. In fact, I suggested it could even be a trough of a 9-year or possibly even an 18-year cycle. Since then, the price of gold, and this is a monthly chart, has indeed been heading steadily upwards. confirming the validity of the idea that this trough towards the end of 2022 was a trough of high magnitude. A quick reminder of what we have been looking at since 2020 in gold. We have a very high magnitude peak over here. That was in August of 2020, and it was a peak probably of the 9-year cycle. Then, according to this analysis, we had an 18-month cycle trough over here in March of 2021. And here you can see the trough in September of 2022 has been phased as a trough of 54-month magnitude, although, as I've just mentioned, it might be an even greater magnitude cycle trough. Interestingly, this trough that formed at the end of September actually formed 3 potential troughs at very similar levels, and so that trough could be better phased in October instead of the end of September. You can see that we experienced an 18-month cycle peak over here at the end of February or early March 2020, and if you go back and take a look at the market update videos I recorded at the time, you can see we were anticipating that 18-month cycle peak. According to this analysis, we are now expecting a peak of 40-week magnitude to form in the markets. So let's go and take a look at a little more detail for that peak. An interesting point to note about the move out of the 54-month cycle trough over here at the end of September, that first move out was a very difficult move. Price moved up quickly, but then stumbled and failed to get back up again. And then it only finally took off after this 40-day cycle trough over here in early November. You'll often see that happening when a major trough forms. Why it is, I don't know, but it is certainly something to look out for. Then, of course, gold picked up strongly and came down and has now been in a fairly parabolic move upwards into this 40-week cycle peak. You can see for this nest of highs for the 40-week cycle peak that peak is now overdue. But of course, in a market that is accelerating out of a very high magnitude trough, and this trough, as I've mentioned, could be of 9-year or even 18-year magnitude, in those circumstances, the peaks will tend to occur very late, and so it is not unusual that these cycles are stretching. What are possible targets for this upwards move? We turn to the FLD to calculate our targets, and you can see 2 FLDs of interest over here, an 18-month cycle FLD and a 40-week cycle FLD, both of which are generating targets to the upside. Now, both of these FLDs are better considered by viewing either weekly or, in fact, monthly charts, but let's take a look at the weekly chart. And when you look at the way in which price has crossed these FLDs, on the weekly chart we generate targets of between 1945 to 1975 for the price cross of both the 40-week and the 18-month cycle FLDs on the weekly chart. As a matter of interest, if we consider the price crossing of the 40-week FLD on the daily chart, it generates a higher target of 2045. However, I would certainly consider the weekly targets as being more accurate in this situation, and so the target of between 1945 to 1975 is, in my opinion, the most likely place for the 40-week cycle peak to form. And so in conclusion, for gold, we are looking at the 40-week cycle peak forming, and as you can see, it is overdue, so the time is right now. We have some targets about $20 above the current price of gold, and so it is certainly possible that gold will rise another $20 to fulfill that target, but we should be looking for that peak to form soon. Let's consider what is happening in Bitcoin. It has been some time since I last recorded a video about Bitcoin, but I want to remind you that we have the new Hurst Cycles Notes service, and we published a very important article about Bitcoin on the 3rd of January, I think it was. We'll take a look at that in a moment. But the important thing to note about Bitcoin is that it is likely that the 54-month cycle trough has formed over here in October of last year. That 54-month cycle trough shows up in our analysis as a result of the rather complex puzzle-solving analysis process that Sentient Trader performs, or that any Hurst Cycles analyst performs. But there is another piece of compelling evidence that that is the 54-month cycle trough, and that has to do with the measured wavelength between the 54-month cycle trough that occurred in early 2015 and this 54-month cycle trough that occurred in December of 2018. As you can see, there were 1,434 days that elapsed between those two troughs, making the length of the 54-month cycle about 47.1 months. And if you don't understand why a 54-month cycle could be 47 months in length, I would encourage you to download the 10 Core Concepts document that I will provide a link to in the description below this video. And so with 1,434 days elapsing in that 54-month cycle, we then measure the next 54-month cycle, assuming that that trough did form in November of last year, and you can see that we have 1,433 days. If you measure that on a daily chart and you calculate exactly the number of days, you might find a few days difference. I'm rather roughly moving my mouse around on a weekly chart here, but nevertheless I'm sure you will agree that is an extraordinary match between the wavelength of those two cycles. And so the 54-month cycle trough, in my opinion, formed in November of last year. As a matter of interest, if we measure the distance between the two 54-month cycle peaks that we have in this analysis, you will see that it is very similar at about 1,421 days. It is very unusual that both a peak analysis and a trough analysis have such even cycle wavelengths. It is particularly interesting because many people see cryptocurrencies as working according to different rules to the rest of the financial world, and yet the cycles that Hurst discovered in the stock markets 50 years ago are proving to be remarkably accurate in terms of analyzing cryptocurrencies. And so the 54-month cycle trough formed, in my opinion, in November of last year. If we zoom in and take a look at some more detail, we can start calculating a target for the next peak. Here you can see the 54-month cycle peak that formed in November of 2021. And here is the 40-week cycle peak that formed in August of last year. And so the next 40-week cycle peak is expected in about April of this year, and that of course will also be an 18-month cycle peak. But in the meantime, price needs to form this 20-week cycle peak over here. Let's zoom in and take a look at that peak, because it is a fairly unusual peak, as I think you can see from this nest of highs. What makes it unusual is that the 20-week cycle circle has been so much displaced to the left. It is quite possible that this small peak that formed over here in the middle of December last year is in fact the 20-week cycle peak and should be phased as such, in which case the peak that we are reaching up to now is of only 40-day magnitude. One possible reason why this analysis is a little distorted in this way is because of the FTX scandal that of course caused this tremendous volatility over here and really shook the markets up. They took a long time to recover from that debacle, and when you get that kind of fundamental interaction or news events influencing markets, they will often cause distortions in the cycle analysis. At the end of the day, though, the cycles always do shine through. And so, as you can see from this nest of highs, price is rapidly approaching a peak, which for now we are considering to be a peak of 20-week magnitude. However, as we have been pointing out in our Hurst Cycles Notes macro outlook every week, the drop out of this peak is likely not to be very impressive because of the fact that the 54-month cycle trough has formed recently in this market, and so therefore there is a tremendous amount of bullish pressure. While I'm speaking about Hurst Cycles Notes, let me quickly go over there. This is our new, we started it last year, Hurst Cycles Notes site, which provides a great wealth of analysis information. And I'd like to point out in the long-term analysis section, this Bitcoin note that was published, as you can see, on the 3rd of January 2023, or at least it had data going up to the 3rd of January. It was published early morning on January the 4th. And you can see this post is speaking about the fact that the 54-month cycle trough had formed in November of the year before. There is only so much that I can cover in these weekly update videos, so I would strongly encourage you to take a look at Hurst Cycles Notes, where we cover a big range of instruments, and you can get advance warning of the fact that an important trough has formed. Here is the 4th of January on this chart. So this is when that note was published. And I think you will agree, looking at this, that reading that note would have given you a tremendous advantage in terms of being able to catch this strong move up out of the 54-month cycle trough in Bitcoin. So let's speak about this 20-week cycle peak that we are heading up into and take a look at calculating some targets. Again, we have some longer FLDs, and so let me switch to a weekly chart, and here you can see the 20-week and the 40-week FLD have both been crossed on the weekly chart, and they both generate a target of about $24,400 for a Bitcoin. And so that is at about this level over here on the chart. Take note also of this 18-month cycle FLD, which is dropping down fairly sharply in the near future, which is likely to provide a little bit of resistance as Bitcoin moves upwards. And so in conclusion for Bitcoin, we are looking at the 20-week cycle peak forming fairly soon. The time is right now, and we have a target of 24,400 as a price level for that peak to form. I do hope that you found this market update useful and interesting. Remember, if you're a Hurst Cycles geek, make sure that you tune in for our geek updates. I'll be publishing some more of those soon. It proved to be a very popular update. If you have any questions, please join us on our Discord server. And of course, you're very welcome to add a comment below this video.